image that I thought would be an interesting introduction for Marie, because it sets up a kind of figure for some of the things that you're interested in on working with the current and the tide. Does anybody know what this is, apart from my arm? So this little thing on my arm is a hydrozoa. It's a kind of jellyfish related to the man o' war, the Portuguese man o' war, and it is toxic, but it doesn't seem to affect everybody. It affects some people. And its English name, like its folk name, is a by-the-wind sailor, and it lives on the ocean surface. And every now and then it comes ashore in mass strandings. It can occur all over the world, in oceans all over the world. This is on the island of Tiree in the Hebrides. We go there to surf. I'd never seen them before until this point. So you can see the sail of it's called a velela, a V velela or velela, and it has a sail. And we were talking about this earlier, but Marie, you've seen these kind of, they sort of inflate and deflate, and they can also align the sail to the wind, so we can kind of guide themselves in on the wind with the use of the sail. So there's some kind of, it has some kind of intelligence that's able to steer itself. You know, it's kind of interesting. But the other thing about it is that it's a colony. It's a colony that carries a population of creatures, a population of tiny Medusa jellyfish that are a millimeter in size. So there's thousands of these living on this colony, and I think it's closer to a spaceship than to a ship, because it's going these vast distances across the planet. But it's carrying these creatures that they eat together. They have generations. They go through different generations on these craft. It's kind of and the other thing about them is that they're asexual, and they occur in colonies of only male and only female on the velela. So it's only ever a colony of male polyps or creatures or these Medusa jellyfish. It's only all male or all female, which I thought sounds like a kind of invention of Ursula Le Guin. You know, you'd have these planets of just female or just male. It's kind of crazily interesting. But the point was just that it was guided by, it was just moving on the current with the wind. You know, so it's kind of strong kind of figure for this thing occurring in nature. It's something that you're obviously attracted to in your work. So.
Thanks for showing that, Paul. I remember I was on the beach. We were talking earlier, and I remember I saw these on the beach in Miami. I was with my boat coming onto the beach, and we saw one in the water, and it had its sail up, and it was moving. And I thought it was just the most, I sort of understood what it was, like just like looking at it, and we were like freaking out. It was like the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And then we got to the beach, and there was just hundreds of them dead on the beach. And we were just like, and they were sort of like, some of them, their sails were still up, and it was just like the most. But I think it was one of these that you were talking about. It was like a huge drift of them had all gotten like washed into the wrong place or something.
It's very sad. I mean,
yeah.
It's very sad. I'm trying to get a tattoo. That's what I was trying to do. Get a stain.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, they're really cool. So as Maziar and Paul mentioned, my boat is in the gallery this year, and I'm going to do a project where I take people out into the port in Rotterdam in the boat. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about my art and about how I sort of got interested in boat making and about traveling in city waterways. So I'll tell you about the project that I do in New York and a couple other things, and I'll try to keep it. My brain is a little like slowed down from the heat, so I've got my like important points, and I'll just stick to that. But I always like to show this picture to describe my interest in urban waterways. It shows Providence, Rhode Island in the this actually picture was probably in the 1970s. And it shows the Woonasquatucket River, which runs through Providence. And it shows the train tracks and Interstate 95 over the top of the river. And when I was in art school there in the mid-90s, they were removing the train tracks and removing I-95 off of the river in an attempt to daylight the river and make it into sort of like a, you know, public attraction. But when I was in school there, it was just like a muddy construction site, you know, cranes and muck and construction vehicles all over it. And but the construction had revealed miles of tunnels that went underneath the city. And so I started building small boats to get into these tunnels that went under the city and making projects. I was in art school and I was sort of thinking about how those excursions that I was taking could be brought into the gallery, or how people could be brought into the waterways. And I was making, at the time, I was making sort of elaborately constructed boats using like plywood to make like a skeleton, and then sheeting that with canvas and using roofing pitch or any kind of like roofing tar, roofing material that I could use to seal the canvas. And so they were delicate, but also I could make these like elaborate shapes. And at the time, and this image is in San Francisco because I left Providence and I moved around and was sort of looking for that same thing that I had found in Providence, where like this, the kind of industrial waterway, I don't know, meets these sort of emerging neighborhoods, and thinking about populating those spaces with these kind of fantastic scenes. My ideal audience would have been somebody like walking by, like a passerby, like looking at this sort of like fantastical thing going on in the waterway, and it would, in my imagination, would sort of like change the way they thought about this industrial space. And then when I moved to New York I moved to New York in 2002, but this image is from 2005. And I started, so I stopped doing those elaborate constructions with like the canvas and the roofing pitch, and I started to use fiberglass and plywood. People have been telling me for years to download plans off the internet and make these sort of more sturdy constructions with plywood and fiberglass. And so that's what I started doing when I got to New York. The harbor was much bigger. I wanted to go further distances, and so I needed something more sturdy that would hold up in those kinds of conditions. And I also started doing something else that has affected my work ever since, and that's using the internet as a way to bring an audience into the boat and into sort of the experience. So in this project, I built a boat and I circumnavigated Manhattan. And so this is like, in 2005, it was like before Instagram. So I was taking pictures with my cell phone and emailing them to my friend who was at home on her computer, and she was uploading them to a website like that weekend at home. And so it was sort of a live view of what was happening out on the water that she was kind of creating on a website. And so people could kind of tune in throughout. Now there's Instagram, but at the time we just had to make it. And so, but it was sort of, the idea shifted for me at that point. Rather than somebody looking at me in the boat and at me doing this sort of like wearing a costume or doing something fantastical, now the project could be looking through my camera, through the computer, through the boat, back at the city. And to me, that was a much more interesting angle. Like, the boat doesn't look like much, the passengers don't look like much, or any different than any other person out there. But sort of the idea that the computer becomes this portal that you can look at the city in this different way.
What year was that?
This was in 2005. And so, and the circumnavigation took a good kayaker can circle Manhattan in 8 hours, and it took us 3 days. We had all this camping equipment in the boat, and I knew very little about the tidal current in the New York harbor. So when I got back from that trip, I started to study the tidal current, and that's the boat that actually we took on the circumnavigation too. But I started to look at the tidal current more seriously, and I started the project in 2005 that I continue now called the Tide and Current Taxi. And so the way the Tide Taxi works is that you email, and this is the way it worked since 2005, is that you email me a place that you want to go, and I look at the tides, the tidal chart of the harbor, and I decide when we're going to go based on when the currents are going in that direction. And so this was the first, Joe Potts was the first person that so I sent an email to everybody I know, sort of laying out the parameters of the project, and Joe Potts, a total stranger who heard about the project through a friend, was the first person that got back to me and said, like, yes, I want to do it. and we sank in the middle of the East River and had to swim to Roosevelt Island, which is sort of an island next to Manhattan. And so that was sort of, you know, the like crazy moment. But Joe Potts was like laughing, and he's like, I can't believe we're like stranded on an island in New York City. It's like, you know, the best day of my life or whatever. And so at that point I was like, the project's over, it doesn't work, like there's no way you can possibly do this. But when I got home that night, Joe Potts' roommate had emailed me, and she's like, Joe told me what happened, sign me up, I can swim. And so I realized that the project could continue. I just had to change. I had to sort of make sure that people knew that that was a possibility, that we might swim. But also I changed the boat. I made the sides higher and changed the shape of it, and sort of made the boat a little bit more complex. And I also never tried what we were like, we had this crazy idea that we were gonna land at this like ferry terminal in Manhattan. And I had this like rope ladder that we were gonna like climb up the side. I had some like crazy idea, but now I'm much more careful about when I go and paying attention to the seawall, and I understand sort of like a little bit more about the conditions out there, and the boat has changed a lot. But the project has basically operated the same way since 2005. You email me a place that you want to go, and I decide when we go based on the tidal current. That's the chart that I use to tell what direction the tide will be flowing and how strong it'll be going. And then I make a blog about each trip that we take in the tide and current taxi, and that's been the same since 2005 too. It's just an image and a line of text that sort of tell the story of what we do out in the boat. And the blog has, you know, been the same since 2005. And I always like to show this picture because it's this guy that lived in an abandoned building on the Greenpoint waterfront. And now the place where he lives is like a massive glass condominium. And so I like to think of the Tide and Current Taxi as this archive that I'm building of like every place in New York City, but also every place since 2005 to 2055, or however long I can possibly do it. I like to think that the waterfront is this place that's that changes really quickly in New York, and my website will be sort of this archive that builds over time of all the different places that are disappearing and changing. So I do the Tide and Current Taxi for a couple weeks out of every summer. Sometimes it sort of grows into other projects and expands, but I always like to reserve a couple weeks out of every summer to do the project. And I always say that there's like 3 different kind of categories of people that come with me. A lot of friends come with me because that's who I talk to about it all the time, and that's who sort of like hears about it all the time. A lot of friends or people that I meet in situations like this come with me. And then, but I always like to reserve a third of the spaces on the Tide and Current Taxi for total strangers that find out about the project online, and that when I meet them at the boat, it's like the first time I've ever seen them before. And this is, I love showing this picture because this is a guy who, his name is Mike Olshan, and he's a journalist. And he wanted to get to this, there's a sunken submarine in the Coney Island Creek. He would like this. And I was literally like the only way that he could figure out how to get there. And he didn't realize that, he didn't like understand sort of the art projectness of the Tide and Current Taxi when we went out, but he knew I was an artist, so he's like, what kind of art do you make? And I was like, this, you're in it. But now he's like, he's a really good, like, he was a really great participant, and he always like sends people my way and sends like interesting articles that I would like, and he's like a really fun like interactor with the project. I also think that the project is about public space. There's a lot of new developments around New York, and the new developments sort of think about the waterfront as this vision, as this kind of like way to sort of change their real estate value, but there's not a lot of sort of permeability to get in and out of the water. So this is this really lovely boat dock that one of the architects designed, but the boat dock has a big padlock on it, so you can't get to it. So my friend Yataka is, we're getting coffee from the Tide and Current Taxi, and she has to jump over a fence. So there's a little, everything that we do in New York is legal. When we're out on the water, we have life preservers, I have a marine radio, I pay attention to the shipping lanes and the security zones, but sometimes we trespass to get to and from those areas, and we sort of like jump over fences and stuff, but very quickly. It's like light trespassing. But I also think of the Tide and Current Taxi as a way, I always talk about the just the way that floating affects your observation, and how it's kind of this chance to like let the tide take you. It's kind of like you unroot yourself from like routine and thinking about the city as this grid where everything's really determined and you have a mission and you're like on your schedule, and in this kind of other situation you're floating and your body is kind of more attuned to and it's not even really about observation in terms of vision. You also really feel the water, and you feel sort of your balance in the boat, and so you're observing with your whole body, and it's a really different way to see the city. And it's also really unusual, I think, to use the tidal current in the city. At first, when I first started doing the project, I thought about it as in terms of Guy Debord's Derivé, like using the wrong map of the city to sort of understand the city better. But the more I look at Manhattan, the more I sort of understand the history of the city, I think it's actually the right map to look at the city. I think the tide is actually like, I think that's why, now that I'm now in Rotterdam, like sort of exploring the city, I realize that's why the Dutch were so interested in Manhattan, is because it was this, it's this island, there's this huge tidal confluence around the island, and I think that they must have, felt like they were coming home. And then another thing that the project is sort of, every year I sort of like discover different things and find different things out about it, and one of the major things that is constant is just the amount of garbage in the water, and so sort of pollution and man's impact on the globe has become sort of a major theme in the project. And there's this island in between Staten Island and New Jersey. It's this tiny island that's you can't get to it by except by small boat, and it's covered with garbage. Sometimes some of the areas on the island just seem to be like made of garbage. And the crazy thing about it is that one side of the island is all this floating debris, all these ropes and balls and pieces of piers, and then you walk like 100 feet around the island, and it's all this debris that settles down to the bottom, and it's all these shards of pots that are like 100 years old, and all of this. I know that sounds old to an American, but maybe not to a Dutch person. But there's all this like stuff that sank to the bottom because that whole area is made of huge landfills. So it's all this stuff that sort of got like drawn out of the landfill. And so I started thinking a lot about how the tide is like moving all of this junk around the harbor. And I started making sculptures that were sculptures, installations, videos that were sort of related to that idea of the harbor being like this centrifuge that was moving objects around. And when I was working on this show that was at Jack Hanley Gallery in 2014, I met Paul for coffee. We were both teaching at Yale at the time. And you told me about an Ursula Le Guin short story where a woman is reading reading things that wash up on the beach and has sort of like
in the phone as well.
In the phone, yeah. And it sort of got me thinking. It was a really influential talk with Paul, and it was really sort of influential. It got me thinking about sort of the language of things that washes up. And I was making prints and making these macrame sculptures that sort of had to do with like what washes up, and kind of thinking about this group of people that live in the future, making sense of all the debris that we have left. And I made a video. So the show was those sculptures inside that sort of broken pier installation, and there were videos that were projected into it that showed this group of women that were walking along the beach collecting debris. And in the end of the video, they make this giant mandala, and they're sort of I don't know, you're sort of led to think that it's this sort of ritual that they're practicing about reading the tide, reading debris that's in the tide. But it's also just like I wanted to kind of ride the line between like maybe it's this group of people in the future, or maybe it's just it's just people now playing on the beach.
Where is that?
Where is that? That's in Jamaica Bay. So if it was, if the image was a little better, you can actually see Manhattan from that's in the haze. Right now that image looks really nice to me because it's like there was like ice flows out in the water. The whole beach was frozen.
Is that beneath the flight path?
Yeah, JFK is sort of off to the right. Yeah, it's a really cool area.
And you left everything, I guess.
I left everything.
Did you? Like that was all left? Did it just get washed off?
No, I left, well, you know, actually I still have some of that stuff, so I can't say I left it all. I still have that pink thing in the middle. But a lot of it was left. And actually I went back, you know, a couple days later, and it had sort of like shifted, but some of it had become like more embedded in the sand, so it kind of changed around a little bit and sort of sank down into the land a little bit more. And then maybe I'll sort of breeze through this stuff. It's I also do ceramic casts of all the garbage, like that cone that was in the last thing. There's like objects that I've collected from the beach that have been in installations and prints, and then I've also started to cast it in porcelain. And I made an installation in 2017 that was all of this hanging, all these pieces of trash that were hanging, but it's all porcelain. Big things like this laundry basket, and tiny stuff like the little forks and tampons and little Barbie legs and things. And then the boat that's in the gallery is it's a boat that I designed when I was teaching at a residency in Maine in 2013. And I designed a boat that I thought would be perfect for the harbor, the New York harbor. It's kind of a cross between a dory and a Whitehall. So it has this, it has kind of the bow rises in the front so that when it hits a wave, the boat sort of lifts over a wave. But then it also is sort of wide and can carry a lot of passengers. And it's based on actually a friend sent me an image of an old Dutch fishing ship or fishing boat that I was thinking about as far as like the interior and kind of like where people sit in the boat. And I'm still kind of trying to track down one of those boats and look at it. But it's sort of, so it's based on like my kind of interpretation of a photograph of this old Dutch boat. And also based on like...
That's kind of amazing. I mean, that image is kind of breathtaking in terms of thinking about the Hudson River School of Painters.
Yeah.
And then suddenly two women show up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's kind of, seems quite subversive in that sense as well, but it's such a beautiful image.
That's in that same, this is one of my favorite areas to kind of explore in the New York harbor. Again, the picture's a little blurry, but if you were standing there, you could see like the World Trade Center in the distance. Oh. And yet you're in this area that just like could be, the Hudson River School, it could be a wilderness. And so it's kind of, I like this area because it's so removed, and yet you kind of know where, you always have this like beacon of Manhattan in the distance. And then I thought I would I hope this plays silent. Oh yeah, here we go. I'm working on a project in Texas where I'm navigating the Colorado River. It's a river that runs through Texas, through Austin, out to the Gulf. And I'm trying to navigate the river from where the water starts. Not the source of the river is dry now, but the water starts around Colorado City. And I'm trying to navigate it in sections over the course of the next maybe 2 years. And so these are some, and I'm making these little kind of, it's similar to the Tide and Current Taxi blog, but it'll be all video segments. And so that's kind of an ongoing project over the next couple of years where I'm kind of updating that idea of like the little snippets with video. And so maybe I'll just so that's all I brought today. And maybe I'll just let this play while, do you guys have any questions or anything? Or maybe I should talk about what I want to do next. Yeah, next week. So the boat being in the gallery, we thought would be sort of nice with the idea of like connecting the exterior to the interior and all. But really it's sort of half maybe not even half the project. The idea is to actually go experience it. And so maybe it's good that it's a year away, so I'll have some time to do some research about where we can go and what it'll be like. But yeah, I'm psyched to find out and explore Rotterdam.
How many people can the boat hold? 3 or 4, you said?
I think it'll, 3 or 4, yeah. It sort of depends on where we go. Like this is the same. This is sort of the same size as a boat that I take out in the New York Harbor a lot. And if the conditions are like this, like very flat, it can hold 4 or 5. And if the conditions are more like the Moss River looked today, it would be more like 3 people would be good. It sort of depends.
Do you have you done much research on what the First Nations peoples of the area use of the tidal river would be? And does it reflect in your work, or does your work, is it more of a sort of personal rediscovery of this post-colonial cityscape?
I definitely think about that a lot, and I guess like I had this sort of like unsubstantiated theory that Manhattan was a trading place for the Lenape because of the tide, because the tide will take you there and then take you away like 6 hours later, and it's literally like clockwork. Like you can completely tell where, and I'm sure that they used the tide to navigate. But then I did a long trip a couple summers ago, and I realized that like 3 people in a good canoe, which I'm sure the Lenape had, they would probably just paddle against the tide when they had to, and maybe take a long lunch or something. So they probably didn't like time their comings and goings, like, okay, tide's going out, let's all get back in the boat. They probably just like used it to their advantage when they had to, and then waited, took a longer break when it was going against them. And the wind, and really like the wind conditions are, it's like, yes, I think about the First Nations a lot in New York, and think about how the island must have functioned. And you know, there's still tons of tribal activity around the waterways around there, and it's an interesting time to think about those people that are, you know, still paddling. There was there's a group of First Nations paddlers that go down the Hudson every year to commemorate this treaty that they had with the Dutch. And I met them at some point and traveled with them for, you know, like, I mean, I sort of like joined their boat, but I've always wanted to actually do the whole paddle with them. But yeah, I think about them a lot.
Is there any of their boats left? Is there anything left of their marine craft?
No, but they're still building boats in the traditional way. So I don't think that there's anything. I mean, right. Yeah.
And definitely they would have had a much more refined sense of time and tide.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking of like on the island of Tyree, where that photograph of the beneficial statement, we follow the tide through the sheep. So the sheep are going onto islands and coming off of islands before the tide.
Right.
Every day.
They know.
It's changing every day, but different time. But they absolutely know it. And I think people living in those lands.
Yeah, you get a sort of another clock.
Yeah. That you have this sense of the signals of the landscape and the times of the situations,
right, in
a year-long sense, and in a day sense, a daily sense as well, a seasonal sense.
Yeah.
And it's sort of interesting.
Do you have, after doing this for so many years, do you have now a sense of the behavior of the tidal behaviors in Manhattan, or is it still unpredictable?
It's completely predictable.
Completely predictable.
But the wind is not predictable. So the wind is also a factor, and the wind can really affect the way that the tide and wind acting together can really affect the conditions for a small boat.
These islands, because recently I met this friend of yours, Lisa Hunter, in London.
Yeah.
Is it Lisa?
Yes.
So she told me that there was this thing that the island is visible twice a day.
Twice a year.
Twice a year.
Yes.
Yeah. Which she claimed to have sold.
Right.
As a work.
Right. Yeah. So there's an island in the New York Harbor that it's basically a sandbar. And again, like my own little theory about it is, it has a name on maps that are like 150 years old. It has a name, but now it doesn't have a name anymore because I think, and it's called Oyster Island. And I think it's because there used to be a hard bed of oysters on it, and the oysters all died like 100 years ago. And so now it's just a sandbar. And so for a show that Lucy Hunter curated, I sort of suggested that was for sale.
Okay.
or with the help of them, we kind of suggested that was for sale. And then we took a trip there, and when I kind of developed that concept, I didn't really know that it, if we could see it, but we planned a trip out there. We planned a trip to sort of float by in the ferry and look at it, and it was visible. We saw it through binoculars. And then a couple weeks later, I actually went out to it and stood on it. And it comes out maybe like 5 times a year. When the tide is really, really low, you can actually stand on it.
Because I thought she had told me that she'd sold it twice.
She can keep selling it
scam,
she can just keep selling it. Yeah. Every time it comes out, she can get another, like, I don't know, however much.
And you said at the beginning that you had like taken into account an ideal viewer from the outside.
Yes.
And also kind of have like reaction on your work. So do you still take that into account, or is it more like the participant is the one that is?
I guess I think of the participant a lot, but I also think of the viewer online a lot, and how, like, sometimes if I think of the Tide Taxi as a public artwork, it's very private in terms of who actually comes with me in the boat, but then it's this public artwork because it's viewable online, and it kind of, the archive, just like, I like that aspect of it as a public artwork because it doesn't require any, like, it doesn't require a lot of your time. It doesn't sort of like, it doesn't demand anything. It's just sort of waiting for somebody to kind of navigate down this like weird path to get to it. So I think of that as it's kind of, I have like many ideal audiences, but one of them is somebody that's like Googling a particular place, and then an image that I've taken out in the boat comes up, and then they're like, oh, what's that? Way of seeing it, and then they'll sort of like navigate through my website based on this like kind of channel. And so I like that. That's kind of like, I don't know, sometimes I think about that as my ideal audience too.
And maybe eventually kind of joining you?
Yes. Yeah, that's the best. Yes, Jeff?
How important is the writing?
I think about I sort of labor over the writing on the blog. I like think about it a lot. It changes a lot. Like sometimes when I look back at ones that I did a year ago, or like 10 years ago, I'm like, oh, I really want to like change that, or I want to go back into it. But I don't know. I think I'll like keep it for now, and I'd love to make a book with some of the writing at some point. But yeah, I think the blog posts are sort of like important about how I tell the story and kind of what we discover. I like to think of it as like I'm telling the story through the participant's perspective. If it was just me going out over and over again, I feel like my perspective would sort of be ordinary. But I like the idea that I like to tell the story from like what the participant sort of, I don't know, saw or experienced.
I don't know why I have to think that today there was someone was talking about Heart of Darkness, and that it's, let's say, how civilization and savagery coincide, basically.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it has some kind of, some of that aspect, I have a feeling, because of its very rudimentary form, the boat being the, taking the individual through the rivers, and almost like an explorer, but also as a maybe even a convict,
right,
in some sense, expelled by the society or something.
Right.
I mean, I don't know, but it's not a question. It's just.
I love that story, and I like thinking about the. You saying that makes me think that a lot of times people will say like, well, why do you have to make the boat? Why does it have to be this homemade thing? Would the Tide and Current Taxi be the same if it was just like a canoe that you used? Mm-hmm. And I think that it has like a, I don't know, it maybe contains some of that where it like, I feel like canoes have like a sport boat has this, has like a different feel. It sort of looks like something you're exercising in, or, and this, I don't know, to me, like even from a distance, you can tell that there's something weird about it. Mm-hmm. And it sort of puts you in the frame of mind that something else is happening. There's some other kind of activity going on.
I guess it also helps put you closer to an affinity with people of a previous age. They were making the boats and sailing the boats, and they seem to be kind of coterminous, that you know how to make a boat. It has a relationship to the water.
Yeah.
You know how to sail a boat, which has a relationship to the water.
Right.
So you kind of it's more holistic, isn't it? In that
Right.
sense of having some affinity with what it was like in the past.
Yeah.
You can't really become that, but
Right.
just to kind of, you do have a sense of the water and the tide and the landscape and the places, the landmarks,
Yeah.
the sort of climate, the weather, the conditions, all those things that you sort of know.
Right. And I think one of the conditions of taking the boat out in Rotterdam or New York is that you have to, a lot of times you're stepping off of a hard, instead of like launching off the sand or launching off of a beach, you're launching off of a hard edge. And so, like sometimes I think like that I'm designing this boat because it's like the perfect city, it's the perfect way to like use the tide and also use the city. But probably after this experience of taking a long boat ride, there was a canoe that accompanied me for like a week, and I realized like a canoe is just the best like form. It's just the Lenape had the best way of taking like 4 people and a bunch of stuff miles and miles. Like this thing would lag way behind like a perfectly designed canoe. So I sort of like had this idea that I was coming up with this like better shape or something, but it's like not true.
They would just catch up with you and kill you.
Yeah.
Did you have any time to look at the harbor? Or
I've been, yeah, but not in the boat yet. I've just had time to walk around and look at it and think about if it might work, and I look forward to like researching it more and trying to figure it out. But yeah, it's an amazing spot. Amazing.
it goes all the way down there, right? It's
Yeah.
like huge.
Yeah.
But it's all artificial, no? Actually.
Yeah.
Man-made.
Well, not artificial, man-made.
Well,
Yeah, like the banks
So
have
it's not- yeah,
been
it's not artificial.
changed. Yeah.
And there's also this bus in Rotterdam, maybe you have seen it. It's called Splash.
Just go in the water.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Didn't one of those like in Boston sank and killed like 30 people or something?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. They're notoriously like dangerous.
An amphibious bus.
Yeah. It like drove off into the water and just kind of kept going down.
Oh my god. This is safer.
Yeah, okay. But they're military, they're like reconditioned military vessels. So they're that safe.
There was one thing I was thinking about was this New Yorker profile on you that was really funny because it sort of legitimized the project
Yeah.
in a humorous way, but it
Yeah.
legitimized it as if it was a sort of marine equivalent of Uber.
Right.
And so to position it like that is kind of I like that. I mean,
Yeah.
it with humor, but it was
Yeah, in the very first year, it was in 2005, and the New Yorker wrote, a New Yorker reporter came out with me, and we went for a trip, and they wrote about it, and they didn't say that it was art. They just wrote about it as like this, and it was cool that they sort of like, they just told the conditions of the project and laid it all out, and it was cool.
yeah. If you want to get a ride to work, this
Yeah.
is Marie's number.
Yeah.
You might not get them in the right week.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else doing this? I mean, not necessarily as like an art project, but do people have small boats in New York?
Yes, there's tons of like canoe clubs and kayak clubs, and it's more. In 2005, it was like one canoe club, and now there's many, and it's increasing in popularity. And really, like the canoe clubs are sort of people are gaining awareness of the waterfront, and they're doing really great sort of activism around water quality, and so it's really amazing. But yeah, there's tons more, and yet I say that. But you could still go out into the New York harbor for like 6 hours and not see another small boat. So there's lots of canoe clubs and things, but still it's just such a huge area that there can be thousands of canoe clubs and still lots of space to explore.
But that's more recreation, I guess. So people don't really use it as like a way to get around at all. It's not a culture. It's like
I'm sure that I've never heard of a commuter that uses it, like that's how they're going to get to work, but I feel like that's not far off. There was like an Urban Outfitter advertisement that showed like a guy in a kayak at night. So I feel like it's just like right around the corner that like it's just completely popular, which would be cool.
Have you ever fished
I've taken somebody out in my boat with fishing. I mean, I fished when I was a kid or whatever, but I've taken somebody out in the boat with fishing equipment. We didn't catch anything. But every time I go, sometimes when I launch from piers and there's guys fishing on the piers, they're always like looking at the boat and like asking how much it costs to build it and stuff. Like, you can tell they're like, think about it. I'm sure, yeah, there's tons of people fish in the New York Harbor, but the day that I went out with a fisher person, we did not catch anything.
Gotcha.
We were determined to like go out in the boat, catch something, and then eat it for dinner. But we ended up like going to a lobster joint or something. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, if anybody like knows about, if anybody has like contacts, if anybody wants to come out in the boat next year, or if you have any information about, I don't know, the harbor, you can get in touch with me through the gallery, or we can exchange information.
Let's say actually, we can subscribe to the next trip.
Yes, you can subscribe for the next trip. Everybody in this room could go out.
Free one.
In like 2 different trips.
2 different trips.
Yeah, maybe 3 different trips actually.
3 different trips.
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody for coming as well.
Yeah, thanks for braving the heat.
Bridges for you.
Yeah, there's beer in the fridge.